It's already out of
Yeah,
service.
It is out of
yeah.
service.
Well,
If-
so we'll get a new cab and then look into whether or not something can be done to really look at the rest problem.
So, if I might speak to that, you certainly could decide to defer this, and the elevator could stay out of service for 2 more weeks, and we could come back with more information about that, in answer to that question. A little more information, though, about what is similar and what is different between the elevator and the 2 stairwells. So, I believe this to be true. I will say that what I'm about to say about the elevator, I don't know for sure, but I believe it to be true. What I'm going to say about the stairs, I know to be true, and I think it differentiates them. I believe the elevator is in the location and surrounded by the materials that it was planned all along.
Designed to have.
Yeah, the original design was for it to be that way. We know that the stairwells were meant to be interior structures, and that as a cost savings in the construction, the protective walls were removed from the program and the stairwells were built as interior materials in an exterior condition, and they didn't last as long as we expected them to last, and they're being fully replaced. We don't have reason to believe that the elevator is in exactly that same circumstance. We believe that the elevator, for in part the reason that Patrick cited, and in part just wear and tear on an elevator in that kind of a facility that does get exposed to the elements, that there's a variety of other conditions that make it not likely to last as long as an office building, have caused this to be its time for that cab. If you still have sufficient concern that the encasing and protecting issues should be more fully addressed before you make a final decision about this, we can bring that information back in 2 weeks.
I'm happy with your response.
Other members of the board have any? When I saw David coming back in, I was trying to pause for him. Oh, there he is.
Not on the elevator. I did want to say one positive thing, which is I took a look at the stairs today. They're looking good on the west side. I have a question about that. Is it? Or maybe I shouldn't be asking, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. The very bottom set, is that also going to be replaced? Because the top is looking great, but
Yes.
the bottom, the very bottom, is yet to be done.
I think
Go ahead.
the answer to that is yes, eventually.
I mean, it's not unsafe or anything.
Right.
It's just
There are 4 flights of stairs on either side of the building, and so in this last round, we were able to successfully replace 2 of them. We got pretty good pricing. We had only contemplated really doing 1, but we had favorable pricing, which enabled us to do 2 sets. So as future parking budgets and capital requests come before you, I think our plan would be to start working further down the stairwells, because while it was dramatic enough rust damage in the upper floors that we had to close at least 1 flight, there's less severity on the floors below, but they're all rusting pretty good, and they'll be coming before you with each successive parking budget.
Thank you. I just wanted to throw out a comment that I got some constituent concerns about the parking garage, and it is something that people like to talk about. And certainly any concern is wise to bring to us. But I don't have the same concerns that some people have been pointing out. The parking garage is probably not meant to be a beautiful, fantastic facility. It's for parking. And there were all kinds of accusations of dirtiness that I didn't actually see when I walked through there today. The lighting is much better because we addressed that community concern with new lighting. But it is a parking garage, so there has to be a standard of reality, I think, here. And I don't really think it should be something where people should walk in and expect to be able to eat off the floor or anything like that. It's a place where we park our cars. So we have to balance our community funds against expectations, maybe a little.
Thank you for that rational thinking, Tim.
Thanks.
Appreciate
I just had to
it.
get that off my chest.
Always slows my mind as well.
It's a little bit unrelated to the elevator itself. So
Is the board Well, are there members of the public that have questions about elevator replacement at the transportation center? Nick?
Nick Nickerson.
Hi, Nick.
As y'all were talking, it came to my mind, to ask this question, is it feasible or possible to put a camera into the cab to identify the urinators?
I'm not sure what we would do after we identified them.
I think a better solution would be to
Yeah, I
put
don't know.
more porta potties or put them,
Probably more bathrooms.
yeah.
Maybe one that's open, which is what the porta potty was meant to address, was our need for bathrooms past 4:30 PM. So, yeah, I think as we're moving through the potty project, we're gonna see where we might need some permanent ones.
And we've, for other reasons, we've asked about cameras for, for various infractions or issues, and generally, they need somebody to monitor them, and the quality is not generally, at least the response we got, and the quality is not very good. And it's pretty easy to pull a hat down or something and frustrate them anyway, so we've been discouraged from going that direction.
And I'll just chime in that we have gotten quite a bit, when we did have those discussions that David mentions, we get a lot of pushback from people who are very much opposed to having cameras in any of our public facilities.
Anywhere,
I think there are some
Yes,
cameras,
so-
here and there.
and I wanted to let you
Having
speak.
heard both of
There's some in
those
here,
comments, there are cameras pretty much everywhere in life these days. If you're in a
Your
public
bedroom.
space or a private space that the public is invited into, you should expect that you're probably on camera. And that is true to a great extent at the transportation center. It's true in this building. So for security reasons, there are cameras around that the town employs, and certainly many more cameras that are employed by
Grocery
private
stores,
businesses, grocery stores, banks, everywhere that we go these days. So speaking more specifically to the particular concern of behavior of some people within the transportation center, I will say it's not a crime and we don't arrest people for that, but we also don't tolerate using the transportation center or other public spaces as a bathroom. We have made available facilities. And so people who don't respect the public space are disciplined, but they're disciplined in civil manner, not criminal manner.
That's a good way to put it. Are there other members of the public that would like to speak on this elevator replacement topic? Okay, then I would entertain a motion from this board.
I move we approve the expenditure of $52,500 from the parking fund to purchase a Bay State elevator cab and associated fixtures and controls for the Brattleboro Transportation Center.
Excellent, thank you. David has made that motion. All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, motion carries. Thank you very much, Patrick. And again with Patrick is our next topic under new business, which is municipal broadband. Take it away.
Sure. Well, good evening again.
Good evening.
So included in the backup for this evening's meeting is a fairly lengthy memo that staff worked on for, honestly, a little over a year. In part because it's an opportunity. It wasn't on fire. It wasn't a piece of business that had to be done. So it was sort of a smoldering activity over the last year. But also in part because this was very interesting and very intriguing and required a lot of fact-checking, a lot of research in terms of reviewing all the case studies that go along with a lot of the projects identified in the memo. And then, based upon questions that arise from reading those case studies, going out and meeting with these folks and meeting with these communities and finding out what they've done and finding out what they feel about what they've done and was it a success. And so a good deal of work took place to put this together. I'll try and give it a brief overview, and I hope to calibrate that properly. Feel free to sort of stop me and ask any questions along the way, or save your questions to the end. But the reason the board asked staff to take a look at this in the first place dates back to early 2018. A former town employee had brought up under public participation at a select board meeting that there are municipal fiber optic networks that are being built in towns and cities across the nation, and that they're providing real advantages to the citizens of those communities in that they can deliver low-cost, high-quality services to the citizens and to be able to deliver them ubiquitously throughout the community. Well, this was pretty attractive, and it was also pretty timely, in part because just months before, the FCC had decided that it was no longer going to commit to net neutrality. That was in December of 2017. And so the topic in early 2018 was very present in everybody's mind. The board agreed this was kind of important, we should take a look at it. And so we began an investigation. Place to start in terms of considering any sort of municipal fiber optic or broadband project might be to assess where are we at today. Obviously Brattleboro doesn't have a municipal broadband utility of any kind, but what types of services are available from the private sector today? There's a table on the front page of the memo, and also some maps in the last couple of pages that show the level of available service in Brattleboro currently. And I think what we should do is sort of think about that with respect to, what are the FCC standards for broadband? Presently, the FCC minimum standard for broadband is 25 megabytes down and 3 megabits upload. And what you can see if you look at the table is that fully 95.8% of structures in Brattleboro already meet this standard. Over 99% meet the slightly older standard of 4 megabits down and 1 megabit up. And so when you compare Brattleboro's statistics for available service, this isn't necessarily saying that every location has this service, but nearly every location has the capability of receiving this type of service. When you compare Brattleboro's capabilities to the state of Vermont, for example, you see, we're far and away in better position than the average in Vermont. With 95% of locations in Brattleboro able to receive the FCC standard, whereas only 73 across the state of Vermont. And so this helps to explain something that we talked about a couple of months ago. There had been some new legislation out of Montpelier that had created a number of grant programs to help communities to better address their desires for improved connectivity, and that those programs were really targeted for communities that aren't in the position that Brattleboro's in. And so that was a little disappointing, but it was a fact we kind of needed to acknowledge. Began this research by looking for nearby examples. Were there any communities, within a state or two from Brattleboro that had built their own municipal fiber plant? And in fact, there were. Staff, in the end, reviewed and met with 2 municipal fiber projects that were from Massachusetts. Met with and reviewed a communication union district, which is a collection of municipalities working together, called EC Fiber up in central Vermont. And then met with and worked through some of the partners involved in a public-private partnership just over in Chesterfield across the river. Sort of try and walk you briefly through the nuances of each of those projects and talk about how they relate kind of to Brattleboro circumstances. The first one is called Leverett, Massachusetts, and Leverett is a small town in western Mass, population about 1,800. So think Demerston, something on that scale. They created a municipal fiber optic network in 2015. Like a lot of rural western Massachusetts towns, they didn't have a lot of private companies that were vying for their business. There were very little connectivity in that community. But the people there were, well, they were determined. And they benefited in part from investments the state of Massachusetts had made previously in what's called backhaul internet. The state of Massachusetts created something called Mass Broadband 123, and it was to ensure that there was what's called middle mile or backhaul service to all of the rural communities in western Massachusetts. And so an end mile or last mile service, the type of service where households or businesses would be customers of, had that sort of, big internet connection that they could tap off to distribute to all the locations in their community. And so Leverett was in a really nice position to be able to capitalize on investments that the state had already made in ensuring there was adequate middle mile or backhaul service. What Leverett set out to do, working with a consultant, they established a community standard, right? What they wanted to see was gigabit level service to every location in town. And gigabit level service is 1,000 megabits. It's 1,000 megabits up and it's 1,000 megabits down. That's the way fiber optic connections work. And so that is really, really, really high quality service. And they wanted to make sure it went everywhere. They further dictated that what they wanted to see was what's called an active Ethernet network. An active Ethernet network means that you've got a central hub and that there's strands of fiber going out from that hub to every single location in town. This is as opposed to what's called a passive optical network, where the central hub will send out fiber to sort of community aggregation points, and then those points are split out and serve a number of different locations from there. That requires substantially less amounts of fiber. It's a less expensive network to build. And so what Leverett set out to do is they wanted to build the Cadillac, and in essence, that's what they did. There aren't too many structures in Leverett, so the actual cost of the project wasn't, in fact, all that much. It cost $3.6 million. And what was particularly interesting about what they did there is they funded the capital construction with a general obligation bond. That means that the town incurred a bond, much like the way we did for police and fire facilities, and that property owners will pay to repay that bond through an increase in their property taxes. So regardless of whether an individual household or an individual business in Leverett chooses to be a user of that system, every single parcel and every single property owner is going to pay for the bond necessary to create that network. There are some pros and cons to that. In considering its import to Brattleboro, that currently is a practice not allowed in the state of Vermont. Communications plants, whether for an individual municipality or a communications union district, are required to use revenue bonds. But that's not true in Massachusetts. They can use a general obligation bond, and so they did. They passed a bond vote at town meeting. They built their network. And one of the things about their network, which is particularly interesting from a let's not recreate the wheel standpoint, is they didn't hire staff. They didn't buy fiber. They contracted for everything. And so a network was built on their behalf by virtue of contract. That network is managed on their behalf by contract. The back-end administrative services for answering questions from the public or invoicing or, hearing a complaint or dispatching someone, all of that is handled by contract. And so Leverett was, I'd say, wise not to venture into a business for which they had no previous experience. The end result, like I say, they've got gigabit internet service to every location in town. It's symmetrical, it's net neutral, and given that the repayment of the capital cost does not come out of the fees, they're able to offer this service to everyone for $23.40 a month. So that's really that's better than market. It's incredibly high quality. And at present, it utilizes a financing mechanism which is not available to us. One thing to note, there's a provision in the recent legislation passed in Montpelier that, I'm going to get this right, that essentially the state of Vermont is going to take a look at this. And so the executive director for the Vermont Municipal Bond Bank, along with the secretary of the administration, and I believe the state treasurer, are together supposed to report back to the legislature in December of this year as to their thoughts on whether or not municipalities in Vermont ought to be able to make use of general obligation bonding for communication plant.
Actually, a quick question before you go off
Sure.
the financing thing.
Yes, sir.
I think, I didn't look at the bill, I haven't thought about the bill since it passed, but the bill that the legislature passed this year, I think it included if a municipality contracted with a private contractor, that would allow the private contractors to access municipal bond rates.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. And there's going to be an example of that when we get to Chesterfield.
Great.
So,
But they're in New Hampshire, so it's, They have the same access.
That provision of the law which enabled Chesterfield to make use of that in New Hampshire was adopted and incorporated into H 513. I think it's now Act 79, but that ability for municipalities to partner with a private firm is now something that's plausible in Vermont.
great, thanks.
So, the question is this model appropriate for Brattleboro? Not currently. And, even if it were, I would say, I think it's difficult to expect that, given the relatively high quality level of service that's throughout town, it'd be difficult to expect that a general obligation bond would sail through. It's possible, but it would require a lot of people buying into the idea of net neutrality and a lot of people accepting a property tax increase in order for a model like that to work here in Brattleboro. So the next example was not far from Leverett, but it was in Concord, Massachusetts. And similar to Leverett, Concord didn't reinvent the wheel either. But they didn't reinvent it differently. Concord had, beginning back in 1898, established a municipal electric utility, as is an option for Massachusetts municipalities. And when you look at a municipal electric utility, what have you got? You've got a central location and wires that extend out from there on poles out to every structure. You've got repair staff in trucks that are able to get dispatched out to fix it when it breaks. You've got a back office administrative staff able to answer questions from customers and do invoicing and all those sorts of things. So you're most of the way there. With a few extra wires, not to minimize the whole thing, but with a few extra wires, you can begin delivering internet service. And that's exactly what the Concord Municipal Light Plant built. They developed the Concord Municipal Broadband. Concord is much larger than Leverett. It's got a population of about 16,500 people. And what the manner in which they built out their network was quite different than Leverett. First of all, they had this electric utility, and the way they initially sold this to the public was by pointing out that if we build a fiber loop around this community, we can begin to more carefully monitor and manage the electric utility. It's called building a smart grid. It's exactly what Green Mountain Power did in this area. But in fact, it was Concord Municipal Light Plant that did it for their electric network. And so by building this fiber optic network around town, they could begin to realize some savings right at their electric plant right away. In addition, obviously the municipality was a large consumer of broadband, and so they were able to provide themselves with a variety of savings, having built their own fiber network at the cost of, I believe, $3.9 million, which they also used a general obligation bond. But that initial rollout did not serve the community. It was after that, once they began to use the savings that they were receiving from the smart grid and from the savings that they otherwise would be paying to a private vendor for their own communications usage, and they began to finance the expansion of that project out to the customers, out to the citizens of the community. The Concord plant is a passive network, and so they're not delivering service which is gigabit to every location. They're kind of doing that much more traditional. Well, we've got a 30 meg packet, and we've got a 70 meg packet, et cetera. They're a lot closer to market rates than you would see in Leverett. But as the staff down there at Concord will tell you, where we shine is in service, right? Our network is up. Our people are happy. We're beating the competition at the service game, and given the business that they're in, that's an intelligent way to go about doing their business. What I would point out, that one of the lessons that Concord really wanted to emphasize during our discussions was that when you begin to build out into a communications plant in an area where there are existing providers, you should expect a fight. You should expect pushback from anyone who's got private infrastructure interests that they're trying to protect. And so, long story short, Concord's point was, when you're upsetting the apple cart for an existing provider of internet service, those they can be quite personal and quite pointed, and so that's something that one needs to be mindful of. After the revenues, yes, and so in essence, ever since that initial general obligation bond, they have been rolling out and building their network literally block by block. As new customers are willing to commit to future service, they're able to secure the financing, and they're able to build that network. And they didn't do what Leverett did, which is build everything at once. They're building it out incrementally after they built this initial project. So is this a worthwhile model for Brattleboro to follow? Not really. It would be quite adventurous to start a new utility in a field that we frankly have no previous experience. If we wanted to go down a road like this and build our own network, the next steps are pretty clear. We would need to engage a consulting firm that would help us to put together a preliminary conceptual design for a network. They would need to assist us in establishing the business case for operating that network. And they would need to assist us, and they were really clear that you really need to be part of this and can't just let somebody else do this for you, in aggregating market demand. So how many people on your street are going to be interested in switching to this new service? And the degree to which we can aggregate that demand is the degree to which we are able to successfully secure revenue bonds in the broader bond market. Investors are going to want to know that if they invest in our project, that they're likely to see returns. And so it's a bit of a challenging and uphill opportunity. The next project is EC Fiber. I think a lot of folks will be familiar with EC Fiber. And anybody who remembers back to 2008, will remember that 24 towns at town meeting in 2008 decided to form a communications union district, which is very much like a solid waste district or a fire district. It in effect operates as a municipality and has member towns as its sort of constituents. EC Fiber was going to build out its entire network all at once in a manner similar to Leverett. They had most of the $91 million to build that network secured from a New York financing firm. And then, of course, the market collapsed and investment dollars vanished. The folks who were managing EC Fiber at the time struggled for a couple of years, but eventually began sort of local fundraising. They put together $1 million. They built out a demonstration project in a small town called Barnard, population 918. It was a success and began to deliver positive cash flow. EC Fiber, of course, because it's in Vermont, makes use of revenue bonds and not general obligation bonds. So they need to demonstrate market demand for their services. What you can see, and what I think you can expect, is that a lot of these smaller towns probably don't have any private internet service providers competing for their business. So they are ripe for opportunity for just this type of program. One other thing I'd like to point out, you see Hartford and Montpelier in there. Those are fairly good-sized towns. And while they are sitting members of EC Fiber, they don't presently enjoy service from EC Fiber. And in talking with, I think her name's Carol Monroe, she's an outgoing CEO, she recently retired, of EC Fiber. One of the things she made really clear is that in planning for and executing the development of EC Fiber, they specifically avoided conflict where cable providers would be present. That's why Hartford and Montpelier at this point in time really aren't enjoying EC Fiber in the way that Barnard is. They have a seat at the table and they're a member, but you know, EC Fiber, I think, probably wisely decided not to pick a fight with a big national cable company and instead focus in areas of their service territory where no other service existed. EC Fiber is a passive optical network, a lot like Concord. So their subscription services are kind of a lot like Concord's. You know, they've got a 25 megabit service for $66 a month. They've got a 50 megabit service for $91 a month. Those are generally pretty much market prices. They are symmetrical, they are fiber-based, they are net neutral. The people who enjoy those services enjoy them a lot. They don't have a whole lot of other options in Barnard. And so, you know, I think the users of EC Fiber would definitely call it a success. So the question is an EC Fiber model a good fit for Brattleboro? And the answer to that is possibly, I believe. Recently, there was a meeting over in Wilmington. The Department of Public Service came down and wanted to meet with municipal officials from this area to talk about a range of, for example, those grant programs that the state had put together, but then also the idea of a communications union district emerged. And there was quite a bit of traction in the room as to, you know, the potential for a communication union district in this area. So much so that I believe the outcome of that meeting is that the Wyndham Regional Commission is going to start to put together meetings and allow municipalities from the area to participate. They're hoping to bring down some technical assistance, quite possibly EC Fiber, to talk about their experience and to work through and help to educate the participating communities about Communications Union District. They are a fascinating instrument. They somewhat protect the town from liability. So in the event that a communications union district was to go belly up, the investor's only recourse is against the cash flow and assets of the communication union district and can't then come back to the towns that are members. So at first blush, there doesn't appear to be a good deal of risk in participating. There is a group of people beginning to form and discuss the value of a communications union district in this area. I think it's something we, I'd certainly be interested in the board's opinion, but I think it's something we should continue to participate in and learn more about. It is quite likely, however, as Clay Purvis, the gentleman from Department of Public Service would say, it's quite likely that the outcome of that, at least initially, would be that Brattleboro would be the hole in the donut. Given the fact that we've got existing service providers providing reasonably decent service, the likelihood that Brattleboro would be an immediate beneficiary of a communications union district is unlikely. But as we all know, things change. And, a couple of years from now, the landscape could change, and that communications union district and our participation in it may be just the solution to some future project. But we can talk about that a little bit further on. The last really explicit example, I'd say, is the one from Chesterfield, New Hampshire, and this is the one that David was alluding to earlier. Chesterfield, by virtue of New Hampshire's law, is empowered to partner with a private institution and to allow them access to their bond capacity in order to build communications plan. Incidentally, this is now allowed in Vermont. So there are some guidelines that one needs to adhere to in this process. And Chesterfield followed along with those. They issued a solicitation, a sort of an RFP, to communication providers in the area. And the scope of the RFP is to address underserved or unserved sections of your community. They received a number of proposals. The one they found most favorable was with Consolidated Communication, who bought Fairpoint a couple of years ago. In the process of working through, okay, how are we going to address these unserved sections of our town, Consolidated came back with something quite surprising, which was, well, what if we put aside that scope and instead, what if we strung fiber to every location in Chesterfield and delivered service that way? Chesterfield liked this idea. Here's sort of how it's going to work. The folks in Chesterfield passed a bond. I think it's $1.8 million. I believe it was 1.8. It's either 1.8 or 1.9. 1.8, sorry. And Consolidated Communications will use that money to extend fiber to every location in town. You can actually see this going on today as you drive around through Chesterfield. There's Consolidated trucks kind of all over the place, and they've been working all summer trying to get this put together. The customers in Chesterfield will pay standard market rates for internet service delivered over fiber. I don't have their price menu at this time. I'm still trying to track that down, but I'm told their standard market rates are what will apply. And in addition to that, customers who choose to make use of this service will pay a $10 a month additional fee, which Consolidated will gather, and that will be used to pay down the bond. So it's a 20-year bond. It's $1.8 million. You're going to sign up. You're going to pay what is essentially fair market pricing for that type of service. You're going to pay $10 in addition to that each month. At the end of that 20 years, Consolidated is going to own the network. For the period of that 20 years, Consolidated is committed to providing net neutral environment. That was really important to the folks in Chesterfield. And what's especially nice about this type of arrangement is that for those households or those locations that feel, I don't need the internet, I don't use the internet, they're not paying for it. So what I can say, though, is for the folks who do want quality internet service, it's available, but you're going to pay for it. So you're paying, in effect, with that additional $10 kicker, you're paying more than market rate for internet service of this quality. So That is an option which would be available to us in much the same way that it was available to Chesterfield. It's difficult to know exactly what would be the outcome for Brattleboro. We would have to follow the same process. We would have to do a solicitation for companies that would address our unserved areas of town. You'll notice we don't have too many unserved areas in town. That would then lead to other negotiations for a more robust network. Keeping in mind there are very few people competing for Chesterfield's business today, and there are a number of existing providers in Brattleboro, this could potentially be much more challenging for Brattleboro, given the competition, than it has proven to be in Chesterfield. But it is an option which now appears to be legally available to us. And so I guess I'd like to also, because I think there's a little bit of an elephant in the room in terms of Burlington Telecom. A lot of folks will remember Burlington Telecom. It was Vermont's first fiber to the home, fiber to the location, fiber to the premises sort of project. Obviously, it was done in Burlington at a cost of $33.5 million in the early 2000s, very early 2000s. There was a great deal of competition in Burlington at that time, and the project struggled in part, we believe, because the competition could undercut their pricing, right? If you're a nationwide company delivering service, you could afford, for example, to underwrite the cost of service in Burlington in a way that Burlington itself couldn't do elsewhere. And so Burlington Telecom struggled. There was some real challenges in terms of public funds that were used to underwrite the operation of that business. That totaled about $17 million. This was not consistent with their certificate of public good that Burlington Telecom was operating under. This blew up. I'm sure a lot of people remember. There was an investigation as to whether there was criminal prosecution appropriate. In the end, Burlington Telecom was sold to a private company. It's currently a private company, so it no longer really qualifies as a municipal broadband utility. And the citizens of Burlington were forced to accept $7 million for the 17 that they ended up contributing. So obviously, that's not a model we want to follow. And it just seemed like talking about municipal fiber in Vermont without mentioning Burlington Telecom would be a mistake. So there it is. There are obviously other examples, other communities that have done it slightly differently. I think the challenges for Brattleboro, whether they're any of these projects or whether they're a slightly different project, are going to be the same. We're going to face challenges because of the nature of the service that already exists in town. And we're going to face challenges in part because we have fewer financing options than some of our neighbors to the south. So I guess I would stop there. I think there's a lot here. I'm interested to know if there are any questions, and I'd love to hear, the board's reaction. What do we think of this? Is this something we want to continue to pursue? Do you believe that it's worthwhile for staff to continue to participate in the discussions around a communication union district? And so,
Well, right off the top of my head, I definitely think we should participate in discussions around a communication district. I think to have discussions like that going on around us and we're not at the table would be short-sighted, I think. That's my one comment right off the top.
I'm grateful to the work that went into
Incredibly
this.
interesting.
I had a really fun time on Saturday afternoon reading through this memo, and I learned a lot. And then I had to learn more about bonds and how bonds work.
Sorry.
And I was like, oh, that's confusing. And Paige Martin, the person that brought this to us, kudos to her.
Yeah.
And maybe she's watching from afar, using her hyper-fast internet.
Yeah.
I was really fascinated by some of this, and I guess there were some sort of big questions that I had, like in your research, when you were talking to folks, like say for example in Leverett. Leverett was the one that was like, whoa, okay.
Yeah.
Leverett is incredibly well
So-
documented in terms of the case studies that have been, Harvard went in and did an analysis and put together probably a 150-page report about everything that happened
Okay.
in Leverett. It's
Yeah.
really intense.
Because I'm curious, like, what impact this had on the lives of the people, businesses, and organizations that are based in Leverett, whether this brought people to the area, whether it spurred new ventures, I mean, it sounds kind of like quite transformative. And obviously, yes, Leverett, much smaller place, and,
Is it a wealthy community?
it used to be, because they had this pond.
The
There
way
it
it's
is.
described to me is that there are a lot of professors living there. There's a lot of universities nearby.
What is that?
Just do a point for the
But,
company.
I'm sure that's obviously not the whole story for the community. It's-
So was there any kind of like study done about like the kind of quality of life impacts and the economic development impacts of this change?
more on the process and less on the sort of outcome. But, we can reach out and sort of, talk to the man on the street or the,
Right.
and see
People-
what they're saying.
Yeah, I mean, because it's cool that 95% of Brattleboro has basically okay internet.
Mine's terrible.
And, well, I checked mine at home, and it's 60 and up, down, and 3 up, whatever. Something like that.
Mine, I get kicked out twice a day. I already know when I come home from work, the first thing I have to do is walk in my door and unplug the router, go
Yeah.
to the bathroom, come back out and plug it back in.
It sounds like you should give them a call. What was I going to say? Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about, like, it's great that we have, like, basically acceptable internet, and also, as we think about the Brattleboro of the future, and even of, like, the very near future, and knowing our challenges around, population and economic development, like, striving for things that will bring people to our town. I mean,
I would almost
I would
move to Leverett.
imagine like young people would flock here to start businesses if we provided something visionary like this. But also, it sounds quite tricky.
Quite.
I'm going to be quiet now.
Quite
Quite
what?
tricky to do.
I thought you said
Yeah.
trippy.
I did too.
It's super tricky as well.
I did too.
So yeah, so I'm kind of curious more in the kind of like qualitative
Sure.
kind of impact, and I guess also the economic development impact.
Well, I thank you again, Patrick. This was very interesting. And it seems to me that Brattleboro's probably good enough for the time being. But more importantly, I was struck by the fact that the judge had an opinion about net neutrality today in the courts, and found that states have the opportunity to make their own net neutrality rules. And so I would look to our legislators, one of whom is sitting right here, to see what they can explore in terms of, I think the bigger beef that we have in the future is net neutrality. And I think some places in town have much better service than others, but the surrounding towns have a much more difficult time. And so when we're talking about joining some sort of a union, I think we might be in the same kind of hub situation in terms of, bearing an undue cost burden that the surrounding towns in order to provide service. So I'm not quite sure that I'd be in favor of that. But I do find this very interesting, and I'll bet you that that town in Massachusetts, that's a real selling point for them, but not necessarily necessary for us.
Tim?
Oh,
I was just going down the
Oh,
table.
okay,
You
great.
could say pass if you want.
no, that's fine. Fantastic report and very fascinating, as everyone's saying. it brings up so much for me, like, there's so many different tangents you can go off on. But one thing that I keep coming back to is this early in your report, where you talk about 95.8% of Brattleboro being served by broadband. Let's put that in quotes, because part of the problem here is everybody has a different sense of what they mean by broadband. When people say fiber, they usually mean really fast broadband, but the minimum definition being whatever,
25.3.
Yeah.
3 is something that my business couldn't deal with. I have to pay extra, and the business pays for it, so it's part of doing business. I have to pay extra for I'm trying to squeeze out 10 to 12 up, because I'm uploading video early in the morning, because that's when it works the best. So large video files, when you're uploading to YouTube, take a lot of time, even at 10 or 12. So obviously, when I look at Leverett or whatever the parody ones were, when you're talking about 1,000 or even 100, it's amazing to think that you're getting those upload speeds. So part of the start of the conversation, and I'm sure some people will chime in, has to be, what do you mean by broadband, and what is the level of service that everyone deserves or should have access to? And is it fair for people to pay more if they need more? And does that help us make it possible to raise all the boats, to use a tired metaphor? So those are all good questions, but I do keep returning to the idea of, are these solutions in search of a problem, in the case of Brattleboro? Especially when we look at the rest of Vermont, because if you want to make an economic development argument, then you'd have to make an argument that that providing even much better broadband here would draw people in. Well, are they already being drawn into our downtown center, where there is some fiber and fast cable, although I'm a little unclear who has fiber and who has cable. I think we're already doing that, so the return on investment, if it does become a public investment, is another whole can of worms to open up into. And of course, it gets back to my commonly voiced theme of what is the role of municipal government, because it's a thing that I love to think about and get people's opinions on. I know you hate to think about it, but I really do, because I think we should be talking about, we're all in agreement that we should have a thriving library and a really great, safe roads and provide those basic services. But when you go beyond that, where does people's opinions diverge? And how do we talk about that, the role of government? So anyway, there's so much to talk about. I'll just hand it over to whoever else wants to.
Okay. I think role of government's one of the things that I wanted to talk about. And I have a lot to say. But I wanted to point out one thing on that same graph, that same chart. I think that the percentage served in Brattleboro by 25.3, which is you so well described, is not adequate if you're in the video business. It's not adequate if you're in the music business. If you are in any sort of technology business, it's not adequate. I think a more important comparison is the 100 or better. Brattleboro has zero service at that level, but 13.7% of the state, 41,000 buildings, have that level or better. So if you are coming into the state or thinking about coming into the state or like Vermont and are going to look for a place to go, you're not going to look at Brattleboro. You're going to look at those places.
If you need upload, you mean?
If you need, which
Because
in your
download
industry, well, if you think about, I actually prepared something for this because I've been thinking about this and looking into various options and advantages for months. Actually, I'm going to read this because I don't want to stumble. I've been thinking about this ever since I saw an interview on C-SPAN with Susan Crawford, a law professor at Harvard and a writer for Wired magazine. And I think, Patrick, you'll see her name on the Harvard Leverett report. She featured that pretty extensively in the book, and several other communities that have done this. And she wrote a book about the urgency of creating local fiber networks, and the title is Fiber.
Can you not hear well? Exactly. David, could you put that in front of your microphone, please?
Yeah, that is a really good idea. So she wrote a book titled Fiber, and much of what I have to say comes from the C-SPAN interview and from her book. And I'm very grateful also for the initial work that Patrick did collecting this information and bringing it to us. Now we need to explore much more fully a municipal fiber optic system for all of Brattleboro homes and businesses. Communications is a basic utility. Fiber optics has created a technology revolution, and we are not being allowed to participate. We're locked into copper cables, which are like a 2-inch pipe compared to the 15-mile wide river that fiber represents. It's a miraculous technology that means unlimited real-time communications with no interruptions at a much lower cost. It enables new applications, new ways of making a living, innovation, economic development, equity of opportunity, new ways of accessing health services and educational opportunities, and much more that we can't yet imagine. Right now, a handful of companies are limiting our ability to participate in this tech revolution. They have no competition, no incentive to upgrade their services to Brattleboro, and no oversight. We pay $100 a month when, like much of the rest of the world, the rest of the developed world, we should be paying $10 a month, and we're getting second-rate service. It took decades to move electrification from a private system to a public utility. Private companies used every checkpoint they had to slow national electrification and to protect their investments. Why should we wait decades to have cheap, ubiquitous communications? Local efforts are needed to make this happen, and we need to create our own public option for communications. We need to view it as what it is, a basic public infrastructure. Fiber networks last 30 to 40 years. The Burlington Telecom example that Patrick gave, it's not an elephant, it's a dead elephant. It was a terrible model, and they managed it terribly, but that fiber is still there, and that's why those 13,000 high-speed internet connections are there, because that fiber is in place. It'll be there for decades. And they are future-proof. It's not going to become obsolete. Over time, the capital expense is very low compared to the return. The telephone system was expensive to construct, but we made the investment and led the world in communications and economic growth for decades. The capital cost of a public option can be reduced by guaranteed loans, low bond rates, and partnerships with private contractors. We need to explore this now. Now. Whatever business model we choose to follow, public involvement in creating a fiber network will mean lower prices and better communications for the entire community. We will get clear, reliable pricing instead of teaser deals. We'll get better customer service, profits and payments that will benefit our local economy instead of distant shareholders, and the ability to plan our long-term future. We currently pay multiples more than Europe and Asia for inferior service. Korea wired every home and business a decade ago. Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore paid $10 a month for fiber service. Chattanooga, Tennessee, like Concord, developed a municipal fiber system to manage their electric utility more efficiently and to be able to instantly and precisely identify outage areas rather than send trucks and crews out driving around looking for them. Then they used this backbone to provide lightning-fast communications for the entire city. In Colorado, towns representing 2/3 of the population of the state voted to remove industry-written regulations that limited municipal fiber systems. They want a fiber system that means communications in both directions at a lower cost. We need to do a feasibility study and figure out what our assets are, things like poles and conduit and money and community support. We need to see what personnel we already have on hand to focus on this project. We need to explore what network design will best fit our goals and our needs. We need a clear, shared understanding that it is the role of government to enable a widely shared infrastructure that encourages both economic growth and social justice. We need to convene private and public groups and get started making this happen. A good start would be to look into what Chattanooga, Tennessee, Otis, Massachusetts, and Wilson, North Carolina did to get their systems in place. So I hope we'll decide tonight to move forward with this work.
Thank you, David. That was very good. And I'd like to thank
Golly.
Patrick again. This really helped to shape how I thought about the way that you laid this out was really helpful to kind of get my brain in line. Because otherwise it was kind of just one of those things that has come up and then didn't come up and then I forgot was going to be on the agenda and it seemed like a black hole for me. So I really appreciate the way you did this. And I actually agree with everything that David just read.
Thank you.
Can we just go over, Patrick, did you have a general conclusion? I think at the end of each one, you said whether or not the example was suitable for Brattleboro, but I don't remember an overall conclusion.
There was less of a general conclusion and more of a, these are the stories of the communities around us, and this is what they've done, and this is what they've been able to achieve. I think I think each of you has sort of touched on the critical issue at hand, right? There are pros and cons to the condition that we have today, right? On the one hand, it didn't cost us much, and it's not all that good.
We got what we didn't pay for.
There we are.
Right?
There's another memo.
It's the issue about fiber optics as opposed to copper-based systems are the asymmetry and symmetry that Tim pointed out. It's especially important for content providers and or businesses that need to upload stuff and not just consume it and watch YouTube videos. But the question really kind of comes down to what you've been talking about, which is what's the role of government, and how important is net neutrality to us, and are these is there a problem in Brattleboro, or is there a problem for certain citizens or certain locations in Brattleboro? And I think that's a discussion to be debated.
And this is the first time that we've really had this is the first time, like we've tossed it around at this table, tossed it around with the public, but this is the first time we've ever had anything like this to actually spawn a really in-depth conversation. There's a lot to think. The one thing I hated the most was the Chesterfield one. I didn't like that.
Yeah.
I did not like that.
It's a bad deal.
Hook your wagon to CCI, and that for me, good for Chesterfield. I hope it's working really awesome for them. But for me, that does not sit well with my palate.
No.
If we're going to do something, it should be our own, so that we can market it as such.
Well, one of the things that I've heard Laura Sebelius say, she focuses on this issue, is that if we're having problem with service, we're having problem even with telephone service, you need to call and complain and to make sure that the providers are doing their job.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to take?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I was so lost in thought. Yes, come on. We'll do public participation. My apologies. Franz.
Franz Reichsman, District 2, Brattleboro. I think the comments that David made are the most germane comments. And if we want to talk about the elephant in the room, I think we have to also talk about the elephant that's not in the room. And that's the question of what happens if we don't do this. And I think other communities are going to do it. If I was going to start a business right now, I'd go to Leverett. I wouldn't come here. I think the upload speeds are critical. I think an increase in upload speed of over 300 times is critically important. I think if action isn't taken in a well-considered way, we're making a big mistake. I think this is something that's essential for the economic development of the town, and to miss out on this opportunity would be foolish. I don't know what the particulars should be, but I think it's too early to be looking at the particulars. Looking at 4 towns, why not look at 100 towns? I mean, there's many examples of this. Westfield, Massachusetts is one that I'm a little bit familiar with. They've done the same thing. They do have a municipal utility, but who says we can't partner with Green Mountain Power in terms of the distribution system? There are many unanswered questions here. But to even focus on 4 particular places, I think at this point is premature and potentially misleading. And I would really urge a thorough, well-considered way to to move forward with this. I'm not sure what the details ought to be, but I think that's what you should be talking about at this point.
Thank you, Franz. I almost wonder if this needs, like, can there be a way that this hits our agenda, like, quarterly or something, or whatever it needs to be, so that new pieces of information are coming together now that we actually finally have this in-depth kickoff point?
May I speak to that,
Yes.
please?
Yep, and then we'll go back into the
Okay.
public. Yep.
I think what you should be weighing, you've heard words of caution, you've expressed some words of caution, you also expressed some enthusiasm, and you've heard a sense of urgency from comments that have been made. So in balancing that and deciding, are you ready to move forward with something, or do you need to process this and consider it again another evening? I would suggest respectfully that scheduling it for periodic visits isn't the way forward. I think
Okay.
either it's, we kind of sit tight and wait for a breakthrough, like if the landscape changes by the report that comes out in December, making it possible to issue general obligation bonds for this in Vermont, would be something that would substantively change the conversation. So if you take the more cautious approach, I don't think that having it scheduled for any
Okay.
particular interval is as important as just us keeping our eyes on what's happening out in the world. And if you want to take a bolder approach, I don't think that's a matter of how often we talk about it. I think it's a matter of who we hire to bring into the conversation on our behalf. I think we need to hire expertise to advise the town about the various things that we're talking about.
Okay.
I share the excitement about what this could represent for our community, but my greatest fear personally is the fact that we already have competition among the big players. And I think Franz makes a fair point that we need to explore these things and not assume that we know the answers. But that's a big one, I think, for us, is getting some expertise brought into the conversation to advise about how we would navigate in a way that we know that the big ones can, when they've got the nationwide private profit-making corporations, that they're able to lowball a particular market where we're trying to do the only thing we can right here in the only place where we can. And so that's, I think, a particularly daunting hurdle. It's not to say we can't get over it, but I don't see how we get over it without bringing in some consulting services to help us explore those things further.
Thank you. Was there somebody that wanted to speak? Who was first out here?
Put your hand up so she knows who wants to
Yeah,
speak.
you come right up to the microphone that's in the middle, and then introduce yourself and where you're from.
I'm Patsy Cushing, from Brattleboro. I have a couple of things to respond to you. Boy, there is so much fear in the world right now, and there's so many things that start out with, be afraid of this, be afraid of that. I hate to see that perpetuated. And with this, rather than being afraid of this, any problems that might be out there, it makes much more sense to me to take a view that moves forward. If there are obstacles in the way, you navigate. If there are obstacles that say stop, you stop. To start with the idea that there might be something kills the whole forward momentum. And I do think that this is an important forward momentum that needs to be taken for the idea of rejuvenating the town, of adding a whole new possibility to bringing people into town, new people into town, encouraging growth. I think that's really important. Also, what is not talked about, and I know you are not the body to deal with this, however, it is part of the situation for the health of the town, fiber optic is the way to go. If increasing, stronger, faster copper wire technology continues, we are going to see dramatic health effects. They're being seen in Boston already in areas where technology has advanced a step, and in other cities where that is happening. And they will come here if that is allowed to, if we allow that fear of these big companies to keep us from doing something that is much safer as well as faster and smarter and less expensive in the long run. Not in the short run, in the long run.
Thank you. Emily? Thank you. Do you need me to speak over the applause?
Hi, Emily Kornheiser, State Representative hat. I've been attending and part of many of the conversations about the communication union districts, and there's a lot of momentum. Just want to sort of repeat what Patrick said. There's a lot of momentum in the area for that already. And so when you talk about bringing in technical expertise, learning more about what's happening in other places and working, that's already really being brought to the area as part of these communication union district conversations. So know that there are resources that are coming to the community to address these issues specifically. There's a new position created at the Public Service Department specifically to advise communities on these technical issues as they step into this new arena. And so really just want to encourage you all to collaborate actively to learn from what other communities are doing and to pull down that expertise that's going to be available in the coming months. And I know Patrick's looped into all of those conversations.
Great. Thank you.
Great.
Emily. Liz, did you want me to come back over?
Yeah, I just, it's my understanding that Springfield has really nice fiber optic cable.
Vermont?
Yeah.
Springfield, Vermont.
Yeah.
And it might be helpful for Patrick to explore for us a little bit
Yeah.
how they got that and
And
how that came about, and if we can emulate that.
Cool. Members, Ricky? And then, yeah.
Hi, I'm Ricky from District 2 in Rattleboro, and I am curious if part of the vision outcome of this will include an open Wi-Fi networks that people, whether they're out in the street or in different business locations, that they wouldn't have to sign into a Wi-Fi network in order to access the internet.
Would not have to? Is that what you said?
You don't have to sign in and like with a password that's private, and so that they wouldn't have to pay for that either.
I don't think that's been discussed yet in this scope because this is kind of our first in-depth whack at the conversation. Right now, we're really just been focused on what was covered tonight.
If that could be a future goal as part of the outcome of this, I think that would help everyone.
I'm sure it's something we're gonna be looking into as we dive deep into this one.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Derek Jordan, and first I want to say thank you so much for allowing the public to speak on this very important issue. I want to say that I 100% agree with David and his assessment. I also want to say I really appreciated Daniel's comments, and looking into what's worked for other sounds, what's the result, have been for that. Also, Franz made excellent points, I think, on the same topic. I work with a group called EMF Safety for Vermont, and although I'm not a scientist, I've been looking into the issues of wireless and fiber now for a bunch of months, and we have a very strong and active group. We were very involved in the bill 513 in Montpelier, and we testified before the Senate Finance Committee, the PUC. We went up 5 times to Montpelier, and were able to get a health report from the Senate Finance Committee talking about studying 5G. So there's the way I look at this issue is there are 2 issues, really, in broad terms. There's the issue of economic development, and I think that's really a huge issue. And many people would agree that fiber is more secure, more reliable, and has a much larger bandwidth that allows much greater upload, download speeds, and all that. And I think also a city like Chattanooga, which was mentioned earlier, would be another city to study. I hear they've had great success with their fiber installations in the city. So I would highly recommend we look at that as well. The thing about it is, we already had fiber. It's like we're going to go back to the future on this one, right? It's like fiber was better in every way from wireless. It's just not convenient for many applications. But I and our group supports fiber to the premises, fiber to the home, fiber to the school, fiber to businesses. And I think it will be a huge economic incentive and economic magnet for the town. We're losing young people. You know, this is real in this town. They're not staying here. I raised 3 kids in this area. They all moved away, okay? And because there's just not enough for them to do and a good enough quality that they're looking for. But having fiber would increase the opportunities on many levels for lots of this stuff. Now, there's another issue around wireless, and that's the health issue, which you started to address. And our group has been very, very strong on doing research on this issue. And frankly, I was a skeptic, okay, about this whole wireless causes cancer and all this stuff. But there have been thousands of peer-reviewed health studies, non-industry funded studies proving.
Can I hit the pause button here? Can I
I'm
request? Can we keep it to the subject at hand?
So,
what do you think? Because
Technically, we shouldn't talk too much about the 5G because it hasn't been warned on an agenda.
okay.
So we really want to stay focused on what we've been.
And can I just say one thing about the 5G and the fiber, which the board may not be aware of, and this is from our group's research, okay? And then I'll leave it there, okay? Because just so you know, in order for 5G to go in, it needs fiber. Fiber has to be put to a telephone pole, which then becomes 4G. In order for 4G, small cell antennas, to be converted to 5G, all they have to do is push a button and upgrade the software. The way 513, the bill that just went through the Senate and was passed, is written, it is a Trojan horse for 5G. It's not mentioned in the bill, but it's there, and it allows people, telecoms, to put in 5G wherever and wherever they want. Okay?
Thank you,
I'll
Derek.
just leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Derek.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
You
and I
introduce
really-
yourself for the people who are watching
Oh,
on TV.
excuse me?
Yeah, introduce yourself
Oh,
and
I'm
where
sorry.
you're from.
I'm Donald Saff. I really appreciate what both Derek and what David was saying about fiber optics. And I'm just curious if surrounding communities could be brought into it, because like I'm in Brattleboro all the time, but I live in Marlboro, and we sometimes will go up to maybe like a week without service during the winter. It's incredibly spotty.
Yeah.
And the people on my road are actually looking into themselves forming a group and putting in fiber optic. So
I'm not surprised.
if small, I mean, I think it's the same in West Brattleboro, and just, really close to the downtown. So I just wondered if it could be brought into a larger circle.
I think that's, if I'm not mistaken, kind of one of the goals of the, what is it, Communication Union District?
The goal.
Yep.
That is the goal. So that's the table that is already, I believe, active. So maybe speaking with your town representatives to make sure that they're at that table. Emily, did you have, or Michael?
Michael Bosworth, Brattleboro. I think talking about role of government, certainly you want to worry about obsolescence, and this is a big issue for economic development. I think, Tim is one example of a business that uses it, but if our infrastructure falls further and further behind, if we don't do anything, then we have more and more obsolescence. I worked for 7 years at the University of Massachusetts as part of a group that was serving internet bandwidth to 20 of the state and community colleges, and what was considered broadband never stood still. It always was making leaps ahead of, so we always had to plan well ahead because the amount of bandwidth for new applications kept getting larger and larger. So certainly I think the town needs to worry about that. I have one question that follows up on Fran's, who's here. He mentioned about Green Mountain Power, and that occurred to me as well. Whether they've been approached at all, whether they're interested at all, whether they can legally get into this arena at all. Do we know at this point? Or it was sort of directed at you, Patrick. Have you heard anything about that?
Have you heard anything from Green Mountain Power about their interest, et cetera?
I know that there are component pieces of H513 that are seeking to, I believe, motivate electric utilities to explore their capacity for delivering this type of service. I haven't been in touch with any of the electric utilities, Green Mountain Power, or anybody else to
Sure.
continue that discussion.
Thank you.
One thing I'm pretty certain of is that the Green Mountain Power hasn't asked the legislature to allow them to restrict other people using their poles. They wouldn't have to approve that. Obviously, they'd have to be compensated for whatever cost it would have for them, but that infrastructure, to the best of my knowledge, is available at this point.
Then just a short comment about the EC fiber model. If they don't hold currently Montpelier and Hartford, right? At what point, if the service is so good outside of them, at what point do they scream so loudly and have the political will, the political, just status to be able to say, all right, you have to start serving us or we'll go elsewhere. So in some ways, it gives you some leverage at some point if everybody else around you has much better service. Just a thought. And just one small question. You said in one part of your report, numerous providers. How many providers do we have in Brattleboro? I'm not aware of Comcast and Consolidated.
There's another one, isn't there? I don't remember.
Is Verizon here?
There are a variety. I don't know all of them. I wouldn't pretend to know all of them. There's certainly Comcast, Consolidated, First Light,
That's
Verizon.
the one I was trying to think of, First Light.
Okay, thanks. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
There's 2 to 3 big players and then
Yeah.
some. Yeah.
Some little. Okay. So tell me where we should be right now, because I think we're about wrapped up with comments in any direction.
So the board needs to decide, I think, whether you want to consider what you've heard and discussed tonight and have another discussion soon about actions you might choose to take, or whether you want to move forward with something. I think at very minimum, what we can assure you is if you don't tell us to stop participating in the CUD, we're going to keep participating in the CUD. We agree with what's been said about the importance of staying plugged into that conversation that's going on regionally, and as Emily pointed out, what we can learn from the expertise that's being brought to that table. So we're going to do that, and I can't imagine that you're going to tell us not to. But beyond that, for additional next steps, I mean, we could make contact with GMP and find out, what their thinking is on this. We can find out what happened in Springfield, but
I feel better.
those are limited steps. I think if you've heard both from within your membership and from within the public urging to sort of move forward more boldly, and I think that needs to be defined if you're going to rally around action of what moving forward more boldly looks like.
Patrick?
Yeah, in addition, I agree with everything Peter just mentioned. One other thing you may wish to consider is if you found the opportunity to use general obligation bonds for a communication plant to be
Yeah.
something that's potentially attractive, even just the option.
Well, it's way more attractive than a revenue
You may
bond.
wish individually or potentially collectively to convey your sentiment to the folks who are currently investigating this and are required to report back to the legislature in December. That would be the state treasurer, the executive director of the bond bank, and the secretary of the administration.
That would
And-
get us through most of budget season, most of the heavy lift of budget season, wouldn't it? If we waited to December before we brought this back up. I'm thinking of like burden on staff to continue this work while we're also about to put a burden on staff to bring us the budget consecutively for several weeks at a time. But if we said, let's touch back on this after the December vote, is that like a trigger mark for us to get it back?
I think, I don't think you should let the fact that we're entering into the budget period of the year determine what you think the proper next steps are for this.
Brandy?
Because if we were to say, based on sort of seasonal workload, when would this be more convenient to work on? It'd be more convenient to work on just like we just did in the summertime.
Yeah.
And we're not suggesting to you that if you feel a sense of urgency that you wait until we get past town
Sure.
meeting.
Okay. Liz? And
I
then
would
David.
suggest that we ask Patrick, in light of the conversation that we've just held, to come back at our next meeting with next steps that we can actually vote on.
Okay. David?
I'm not sure if Patrick can do that, or, you know, Rod, I don't know about that. But what I do know is that the big providers are not gonna ever provide us with high-quality, competitive service. It's not profitable, that's not how they work. That's why Burlington is getting 5G wired up in the city right now, and there's very little going on around here, and that's gonna continue. If we're willing to accept obsolescence, then, you know, we can go really slowly. I think that at the minimum, to do what Peter first mentioned, which is to identify who has which organizations, businesses, nonprofits, including the people working with the community district proposal, continue to identify where are people who can provide us the expertise to identify what do we really need here, what do we want here, what makes the most sense here. People that have that information, have that expertise, to at least identify them, give us a sense of what that's gonna cost, and then come back and have us talk again about how to hire or engage people that have the expertise to help us figure out how to approach this. That would be my suggestion for moving forward.
Patrick, would it be feasible by the next meeting to have touch base with Green Mountain Power and touch base, as David just said, with who could be helpful, or do you need a couple more weeks than that? This next meeting feels really close.
I'd like to speak to that. So, touching base with some specific entities is something we can do in short order. We can contact
Great.
GMP, we can contact Springfield. The CUD is going to have a schedule of its own that evolves that we're not going to control, but we're going to stay plugged into. So,
Right.
so, you know, we'll bring additional knowledge from that process as it happens. The expertise, and I probably spoke to it in too vague a manner, Lou speaks very specifically to what I was talking about with expertise. In Patrick's report, he talks about that there's a threshold moment when you decide we really want to get serious about this, when you spend tens of thousands of dollars to hire a consultant to be the person who's in your corner
Yeah.
telling you the stuff you need to know about risks and opportunities and costs and timeframes, just like you do when you hire an architect for a construction project,
Right.
and or an engineer if it's in utilities or something. So that's an important threshold moment.
Okay.
That if there's enough support at this table to make this a very high priority, we can begin working on an RFP that would be the way we would solicit for that work. That could well be ready 2 weeks from now. It might not be ready until 5 weeks from now, which is the next meeting after that.
Sure.
But it would be a do it soon item if you were to tell us to do that tonight.
Okay.
You've also heard Liz suggest that we come back and put that option in a broader perspective of other actions that are available. And I got to say, I think based on the magnitude of this, what starting down the road means, I'd like to make clear that I'm not suggesting we don't start down the road. I'm suggesting that if we do it in an informed and cautious manner. If we determine after thinking cautiously about it that we want to be bold, that's a good informed decision. If we want to be bold without doing the cautious thought first, I'm concerned about that. I think it's important that we do consider, for instance, even what this first wave of cost would involve in order to bring the expertise into our process right here, as opposed to just gaining knowledge from the CUD process. So in the absence of a staff recommendation, I guess I'm formulating one to say I like the idea that we bring you back 2 weeks from tonight some perspective about the range of options, from those that are going to be too cautious for Dave to those that are going to be too bold perhaps for some of the rest of you.
Perfect.
And that will help you have a discussion about where you as the governing body want to take us.
I like that.
Thank
Tim?
you.
I like that too. I do want to say that at that, we're going to have to make a little more time, in my opinion, because throughout this whole discussion, and David, that was great. Can I please have a copy of
Yeah,
what
that
you-
was.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not bad.
And Franz made some good points and some others, but I'm going to be very strong in my opinion of let's not start down a road until we know what road we're talking about, because we really haven't defined, as I said before, what is the definition of municipal broadband? What are our goals, right?
Absolutely.
You can't just throw
That's-
out, we want 100. Well, how much of Brattleboro, and how is that going to be delivered? And all this stuff has to be discussed before.
Well, one thing.
Let me just finish.
Okay.
Before we go out on RFP for this.
One thing that I
Because
think
the RFP people do not tell Brattleboro what they need. Brattleboro tells Brattleboro what
Right.
they need. Okay?
Yeah, Brattleboro writes the RFP.
So it may sound like I'm being cautious and pumping brakes, but that's my job, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Also
that's fine. I think it's important to point out that equity means that everybody gets
Yeah.
the same. That you run a fiber to the business, what people connect to it, whether they connect to it, all those things are up to them. But the municipal infrastructure is, you make it available to everybody. So everybody can get.
Well, then the next question is who's paying for it?
Well,
That's all part of
Sure.
what
But I mean,
what we're asking Peter to do.
Well,
all of it.
I'm saying that the ball's in our court to decide some of these things before
We're
we
not-
just
I
don't
would never.
figure it all out, staff. That's a little,
Yeah.
Well, and that's not what I'm
I'd
saying.
be a little weirded out.
But
though,
we're
if it
not
wasn't
gonna be
for everybody.
we're not gonna be talking about how to finance it until we have established goals and engage the community in the process of seeing, what do you want here? What's the support for this? Do people even, we've got a ton of work to do before we get to those specifics. And I think what Peter suggested, which is to go out and find out what information is available, who's got it, how much it would cost us to look into this in a cautious but active way, is exactly what you suggested is
Do
exactly
you
what
need
we
a
should do.
motion for that?
And
No, we don't need a
I'm
motion.
not finished.
Liz?
I want everyone to pay attention to the comments that Emily made, that the state is working on this and the state has expertise. And before we go out for an RFP and reinvent the wheel, I think we need to really study what the state can tell us, what the state has available for communities like ours.
That won't take long. One person for the whole state will find out very quickly. They have very little. But
Well-
find that out.
Well,
too.
I-
That was not the impression that I got from what Emily said.
and the state and Brattleboro may have very different goals. And that's why I keep returning to, we need to talk as a community about
Yeah,
what the goals are.
and I also just wanted to discuss a little about the equity. You know, if you live in downtown Brattleboro, you may have one realm of service, and if you live in a holler somewhere in West Brattleboro, you might have different service. And I don't consider equity to be the town paying for everyone to have equal service.
Yeah, that brings up another interesting question of, I think ideally if we're thinking about our planet, we want to concentrate people. We want people to be drawn toward the concentrated area of Brattleboro.
Oh, I hope Gemma Seymour's watching right now.
Oh, I do too.
I do,
Exactly.
seriously.
Because she makes very good points about this.
And that's what the master plan says.
Exactly, very good point. But in a nutshell, we really should be thinking, if we're thinking in the future and the health of our community in the future, is an inequity of that which would draw people in and not sprawl people all over all of Brattleboro confines, which are quite broad.
Yeah, they really are.
And there would be, everybody could feel free to just live anywhere within Brattleboro if everyone got the same amazing fiber or high-speed cable or whatever we're talking about.
Good point.
To consolidate people is the more earth-friendly way to go.
It's a
I
very
don't
large
see a
and
contradiction
interesting
between somebody that already lives out in a holler someplace having the same access and running their business from home to somebody being downtown and having it.
Because it encourages somebody
It's
next
a
to them buying a
broader
plot
It encourages
conversation.
sprawl.
and sprawling out over the
And
entirety of the
it's,
country.
Where are you-
it's an
Wow,
expense.
this is frightening. I mean, how are we gonna expand the population and get people to come into Brattleboro if more people don't move in?
We build
than build?
the center. We build the towns out.
Build it.
We have this river.
Huh?
Well,
It's a
we're
good
way off
conversation to have,
It's,
is what I'm
it's a
saying.
conversation that has to come up regardless. It's
And I
in the
think-
town plan, people are talking about it,
we might want to, we
I
might
didn't
want
expect
to
it
put
to
it,
come up
we
tonight
might want to try
at 8
and, not
o'clock.
necessarily warn an article,
But-
but somehow include it on the town meeting agenda and engage the whole, at least all the town reps in the conversation.
This is amazing. No, you don't,
I didn't,
this
I didn't
is,
catch that.
I was just saying, we might want to, not necessarily, well, I don't know if we would have an article saying, approve $10,000 or something to hire an expert, but we could bring this to town meeting for a conversation there as well.
yeah, I don't
Well,
think.
we
it's
Because
a
could
bad
obviously, we're
idea,
all over the
actually.
place about this, and I'm not sure the community is, but
Let's wait till the
We'll see.
next meeting before we talk about town meeting.
that's what we've been suggesting.
Were you gonna say something, Daniel?
I mean, I guess not. I think a lot has been said.
You have something new to say,
It's hard not.
anything new to add?
So I saw a figure of what 60 to 80,000
I think so.
for like consultant.
Right.
That's
I
a
think
lot
so.
of money. That's like the same amount of money, well, more than the amount of money that we put into the Work Today program. I'm just kind of thinking about like recent big things, so like there was the ladder truck a couple of years back, and if the Leverett job was nearly 4 million for a town of 1,800 people, 1,800. Yeah, I just like I'm excited by the idea in some ways, but I'm also like, is this the thing that the town of Brattleboro needs to be spending X millions of dollars on when we have really urgent crises right now that probably won't be solved by increased download and upload speeds?
All right,
And if we
so-
don't make long-term investments,
No, I get it, right? I get
Yeah,
it. I mean,
we're not gonna
everything
have a
is about
future
that
anyway.
today, right? And so I think we should make investments, and I think we should be cautious about how we do those.
So I look forward to you bringing this back to the next meeting.
May I just put a ribbon around it by saying, based on everything that we've heard, I just want to manage expectations. We won't do additional research in this 2-week window. What we will do is frame questions and what we perceive to be the range of options for you to decide on next steps.
That'll be incredibly helpful.
And then from that discussion, it'll lead us out to where you might or
Thank
might
you.
not want us to go do additional research.
That would be incredibly helpful. Thank you very much.
And maybe members of the public will reach out and say, hey, this is really important to me, please.
Yes.
hopefully we'll hear from the
Or
public.
not.
It
Maybe they'll
depends
reach
on
out
how
with
good a
some
job Chris
positive
does getting the
feedback and
story out.
excitement. That'd be a change
You'll-
than the
always
emails I've been getting.
Yes.
Okay, so at this time, we are going to move on to item D under new business, and that is going to be announcing committee vacancies.
I don't know. We all lost our bets.
Oh, shoot.
Brandy won.
Actually, that's true.
I could still
So,
win, actually.
many people wonder, what can I do? How can I be involved? And you can run for the select board, obviously, but there is a significant time commitment. You can run for representative town meeting, which I would encourage every single solitary registered voter to do because it's an important window into the process. But for some people, that's not quite the right fit either. So here's some other opportunities. You can join the cemetery committee where there is one vacancy.
Everyone's dying to get on it.
Liz. You can join the Citizen Police Communications Committee, which is very interesting. And there is one vacancy on the Citizen Police Communications Committee as well. You can join the Conservation Commission. There are 3 vacancies on the Conservation Commission. You can be a Design Review Committee alternate. There is 1 vacant position. You can be a Development Review Board alternate. That is a very powerful board to be on, as a matter of fact. And there are 2 open positions. There is 1 open position on the Energy Committee. There is 1 opportunity to be a fence viewer, where you literally view a fence. There is 1 opportunity on a committee of 1 person to be the inspector of lumbers, shingle, and wood. And finally, there is 1 available seat on the Planning Commission. So,
Speaking of the future of Bratt.
speaking of the future of Brattleboro, and since I have said all these things in a public forum, including speaking of the select board and representative town meeting, I shall no longer be approached asking how people can be involved, because I have read it to you.
All right.
Yikes.
On that note,
Not even 9 p.m. and we're already flipping, I see.
I call it being bippy. I'm getting bippy. Okay, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Wonderful. Meeting adjourned at 8:32.
Boom. You win a prize.
I think I win because you're.
I want a lollipop.
At 8:15.
I said 8:20.
7:45.
Well, first I said 8:39, but then I changed it to 8:28 if I had left it where it was.
I said
What is this?
37.